What an eventful and interesting start to the first sprint weekend of the 2024 season. Dear Motorsport-Magazin.com friends and Formula One fans, China delivered on its comeback. There was a lot going on in the first and only free practice session, both on and off the track. Off the track, of course, was the big story, the fire that was suddenly there. Nobody could explain it. Then we go into the sprint qualifying later and the fire comes back, but in a different place. Let's take a closer look at that before we talk about the sporting side of things, which is really something today. First of all, the fire. We go back to the first and only free practice session. Suddenly it was red. The cameras panned over and showed a fire in the runoff zone. The grass caught fire, but we don't know why. The fire was quickly extinguished and the session was resumed after a short interruption. Then we go into the sprint qualifying, and at the end of SQ1, the drivers report back, wait a minute, there's a fire. The FIA had a look at the whole thing because they couldn't see a real cause of the fire at first. Some people might jokingly think that Nico Rosberg is on site, and that's a bit of a story as far as fire and explosions are concerned. But no, of course, the FIA has to take a serious look at it because the conditions were not such that you could say that the sun was so strong and we had a dry period that something could catch fire. Quite the opposite. It had rained quite heavily in Shanghai the days before, and the weather wasn't particularly good that day either, and then the rain came later, so that couldn't really be the reason. The FIA's initial analysis was that the sparks from the cars caused the grass to catch fire. The cars had been spraying more sparks again for a few years now. In 2015, the year of the Titans, titanium skid blocks were made mandatory again. These titanium skid blocks, there were skid blocks before, but they were made from other materials and were significantly heavier, have protected the underbody much better, because these skid blocks are there to protect the wooden underbody. It doesn't have to be wood, they like to say, but it's a wood-like material in terms of density, and it has to be protected so that it doesn't wear out too much during the race weekend and especially during the race. That's why there are these metal plates around it, and they are the first to touch down and spray sparks. Since 2015, titanium skid blocks have been mandatory again. They spray beautiful sparks. So far, no big problem. Looks spectacular. The drivers haven't actually reported any major problems. Even if it gets a bit into the helmet or the visor, everything is okay. But now they've apparently caused the grass to catch fire, and that's an interesting story. As I said, the external conditions were not such that it would have been conducive to this fire. I'm sure the FIA will take a closer look, because if the external conditions are a bit different, if we have a period of drought and the sun is really beating down, then something like this could be quite dangerous if you don't get such a fire under control immediately. So much for the unusual incident. I'm curious to see if you can think of anything similar. I've heard that this often happens in other racing series, especially in Australia, but I've never seen anything like it in Formula One. Maybe some of you have been around a bit longer or have a better memory. Feel free to write it down in the comments. But now let's move on to the sporting side of things and go into the sprint qualification, skipping SQ1 and SQ2. It was still dry, and then came SQ3, and we have to thank the fire a bit because it caused a slight delay between SQ1 and SQ2. And if you like, that meant that SQ3 took place entirely in wet conditions. All the drivers were on intermediate tires right from the start, and it was a really exciting session. You could see right from the start that the balance of power could be shaken up, as is so often the case in the rain. Nevertheless, there are a few candidates who are actually always at the front. Max Verstappen, for example, who we'll talk about later. He didn't do so well this time, but Lando Norris did. If you looked at the split times, you knew that he was the absolute top favorite for pole position in the sprint. But then, on his penultimate lap, he made a serious mistake in the final corner and threw away the best time. Nevertheless, it was still a really good time. His lap time was 2:00.863. Despite the mistake on the last corner, that would have been a decent time, but the following lap was even better. He didn't make a mistake there. 1 minute 57 9/10 and 400ths. That was by far the fastest time in SQ3, a fraction of a second ahead of second place and over 2 seconds off third. So that was a demonstration of power, but it's not that simple in Formula One. I said yes the very next lap. There were no cool-down laps in these conditions, no charge laps, no, you simply drove fast laps throughout, looking to see where you could find grip. Very difficult conditions, especially on the asphalt. We'll talk about that a bit later. And yes, now I've said that he made a mistake on the previous lap. He went too far out on the final corner, and that set alarm bells ringing in our editorial team. So we said, wait a minute. Is the next lap even valid? The stewards first said no, the lap was not valid, so they cancelled the time, meaning Lando Norris was not on pole position, but then it didn't take long, and the lap time was valid again. What was that all about? It's a bit complicated, and I think it's still causing a lot of discussion. In the race director notes, the race director always makes it clear when lap times are to be deleted. Under Niels Wittig, it's actually quite clear. There's no discussion. The white line is the track boundary. If you go over it, the lap is cancelled, regardless of whether you lost time or not. That's why a lot of lap times have been deleted. Even if you drive into the gravel and lose 3 or 4 seconds, it doesn't matter. The lap time is deleted. That has always been Niels Wittig's approach. But now there are a few problems with the whole story. On the one hand, he forgot to write in the race director notes this time that the lap times are also deleted in the sprint qualifying, and in the sprint there was only talk of qualifying and racing, so probably a small copy and paste error. And it was not in the race director notes that the following lap is deleted if you go off the track in the last corner. It's not in there every time, but it is on tracks where you could gain an advantage. Historically, Shanghai is actually a track where you could gain an advantage by going too wide in the last corner. But now we have the case, as we discussed yesterday, that we have a small strip of gravel again. That's why you can say, well, you don't have an advantage anyway if you drive out of it. Norris had no advantage at all at that point. We don't need to discuss that at all. But with Niels Wittig's approach, you can of course discuss it, as he generally says that every lap time is cancelled, regardless of whether you had an advantage or not. And then there's the discussion about whether every lap will be deleted if I had an advantage in the last corner, yes or no. In this case, it wasn't in the race director notes, so legally speaking, it's always a difficult thing in Formula One. But if you interpret the regulations in this way, it's not written anywhere that the lap time is cancelled. And that's why Lando Norris got his lap time back and therefore pole position. I mentioned it, there was a big discussion here in the editorial office. Should we now simply say that if we already say that everything outside the white line is always a dropped lap time, regardless of whether you have an advantage or not, then we must also do it in the last corner so that the next lap is dropped? Because if I am so consistent, why not on the other side? Interesting discussion. I'm looking forward to your opinion. If you want to discuss it with us, not only in our YouTube videos, but perhaps also in the editorial office, then please apply. For example, if you don't have much experience yet, you can get a taste of it in a 6-month internship. Very important, all here at our location in Graz. If you already have experience, then of course you are welcome to join us directly. All information can be found at jobs.motorsportmagazin.com. Then we come to the old champions who once again showed what they are made of, especially in difficult conditions. Lewis Hamilton in 2nd position, Fernando Alonso in 3rd. You can almost say it's a shame that Lando Norris kept pole. Otherwise, that would have been a really cool front row with Hamilton and Alonso. Of course, that's a cool starting order. We don't begrudge Lando Norris either, but that would have been a nice story. The performances of the former champions are particularly noteworthy when you look at their teammates. Hamilton in 2nd, Russell only in 11th position. He already retired in SQ2. Alonso was 3rd, Lance Stroll only 15th, and 2 of them were also eliminated in SQ. Now, of course, you can say, well, in dry conditions, there wasn't that much between the two. To be fair, it was in the rain that the old champions were able to put their experience to good use and also exaggerate the true pace of their cars a little. Because in dry conditions, neither Lewis Hamilton nor Fernando Alonso would have made it that far forward. Things didn't look good at all for Lewis Hamilton in SQ3, who had 0 grip, was then one of the few drivers, went into the box, got a fresh set of inters and went out again. It probably wasn't that he got a bad set or that the tires were already worn. No, they only had 1 lap on them. That wasn't the problem at all. They probably adjusted the pressure a bit at Mercedes. Higher air pressure in the intermediate tires ensures that the temperature gets into the tires better. Less contact area, yes. But temperature and temperature were the be-all and end-all, which we will also see with Max Verstappen in a moment, and then it went really well for him afterwards. 2 decent laps and thus on the provisional pole times, but then the lap time of Lando Norris was counted and thus only 2nd place, but really strong performance by Lewis Hamilton. The same applies to Fernando Alonso, who stayed out on his set of tires but also made a really strong impression throughout the wet SQ3, making fewer mistakes than the competition and then finishing third. Of course, it will also be exciting in the sprint, because if you just look at the performance of their cars, they will really be out of position if it is dry, and that could be a very, very exciting duel with the two of them. A duel possibly, or most probably also with Max Verstappen, and then maybe also with Charles Leclerc. The younger drivers in the field, they definitely had a bit of a problem, with the exception of Lando Norris at the front. Charles Leclerc often has bigger problems in the rain. This time he didn't quite get it right in the outlap, spun, had a slight impact, damaged his front wing, and ended up 7th. He himself says that it wasn't so dramatic in the end because the pace just wasn't there. Carlos Sainz, his teammate, also said that he finished 5th. Ferrari couldn't get the tires into the working window, and that's why they were so far behind in rainy conditions. The same applies to Max Verstappen. Even though he was able to keep his Red Bull on the road at least most of the time, but he's actually an absolute rain specialist. We all remember the time in Brazil when he spun and caught the car millimeters from the wall. We remember the stories about this Norris Ring Formula 3 race, when he drove 2 seconds faster than everyone else in the rain, and now he was completely out of his depth. Nothing worked for him. In the end, 4th place on the grid, 2 lap times dropped, and then the last one could perhaps have been dropped as well. Same problem as with Lando Norris, because he got too far out in the finishing corner. He himself says he drove like he was on ice, never really got it to work. In the end, a well-deserved position, so he didn't want to do it anymore. Dr. Helmut Marko, who talked a bit about it on Service TV, said that it was quite strange. It probably also had to do with tire pressures. At Mercedes, you could see that Hamilton couldn't cope at all at first. Then he put fresh tires on, probably with higher air pressures, and suddenly he got the tires into the working window. That didn't work for Red Bull. They stayed on one set of tires, but the funny thing was that the air pressures for Perez and Verstappen were pretty much identical. Perez, on the other hand, made the whole thing work, brought in temperatures. Temperatures went up for him, whereas for Verstappen, the temperatures actually went down while he was driving. Now you ask yourself why Perez isn't further ahead. He had a mistake on his last lap. He would have been much further ahead. Normally, he's only in 6th position, and it was the finishing corner for him too. But why it worked for Perez and not for Verstappen is the big question, the big mystery. If we look at the onboards and the line choice, you could see from the start that Verstappen went out and drove the rain line. He always does that. He's a real specialist for it, of course. Every professional racing driver knows the rain line. You try to stay away from the racing line because the racing line has the most rubber, and the rubber is then relatively slippery due to the rain. That's why you drive a completely different line. Anyone who has ever driven a car in the rain knows that it's even more extreme with slicks. So you should try it out. Then you'll know what we're always talking about when it comes to things like this, or especially what the racing drivers are talking about. But Verstappen left it at that. Other drivers adapted the line and didn't drive such a heavy rain line. They actually drove almost on the ideal line. Sergio Perez, among others, Lando Norris, very extreme. Why is that so interesting here? We talked a lot yesterday about the fact that something was done to the asphalt. The asphalt was sealed, there was a bitumen layer over it, and as expected, this bitumen layer dissolved relatively quickly, so there wasn't much to see on the racing line. However, this bitumen layer didn't provide much grip at first. Now you can think, okay, in the rain, then the bitumen layer is gone, there's not too much rubber on it, so the racing line is perhaps quite good. Next to the racing line, there is still this sealing layer and therefore less grip. So that would have been my initial analysis of the situation. You can have a look through all the onboards if you have access. It's really interesting to see how huge the differences are in some corners. For example, I think at turn 12 Norris was driving. I didn't check. Unfortunately, we don't have the data today, but I would have said that I felt Norris gained a second on Verstappen at this point alone, then drove a completely different line and found the grip that Verstappen didn't find. And when you find the grip, you obviously get more energy into the tires. More energy also means more temperature. And so you have a positive vicious circle, while the other guy has a negative vicious circle. But that was only the qualification, and only the qualification for the sprint. If we now take a look at what awaits us there, yes, the start will be very interesting, because there is also an uneven distribution of grip, the start and finish line. Grip, the start and finish straight is like this, or the starting positions are such that you drive across it. So now I'm curious, Verstappen thinks he's on the bad side. So the start will be quite tricky. but I still think that Max Verstappen will go into this sprint as the big favorite if it's dry, because 19 laps on the Shanghai International Circuit is a decent distance on one set of tires. The front left tire gives up relatively quickly. We've already seen that in practice. And I would say that the Red Bull is still the big favorite, with one caveat, and we've said this several times in advance: graining could be an issue, and the front axle, which have not always been the Red Bull's greatest strengths. But Verstappen, I think they've got that under control. He was very happy with the dry performance. He was also in first position in SQ2, so I'd say some drivers who start out of position at the front, especially Alonso and Hamilton, of course, if I had to bet my money, I'd bet it on Verstappen. But it's all set, you can see, for a really exciting sprint. And then we also have qualifying for the Grand Prix. It really will be a spectacular Saturday. I'm looking forward to it. I think the new sprint format is already a success, and of course our print editions are always at least as successful. Last chance, issue number 95. The first issues of issue number 96 have already arrived in Germany. It smells great again, but apart from the scent, there is of course also really exciting content. For example, about the engines from 2026. You haven't read so many details about this anywhere else. I promise you that. Exclusive story with the FIA technical director Nicholas Tombazis. Everything on abo.motorsport-magazin.com. All this and of course much more.